like to welcome you to today's webinar, Cloud Computing, the Big Three, comparing AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. I'm going to hand things over to our featured presenter today. He is a technical trainer for New Horizons, Mr. Sean Boland. Sean, you now have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mayan, and welcome to everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where you are at. As Mayan mentioned, my name is Sean Boland. I'm with New Horizons out of Omaha, Nebraska, smack dab in the middle of the country and smack dab in the middle of winter. Rather get rid of that last one. You see my email address there on the slide if you want to copy that down. I'll also have it on the last slide today. I always give out my email address to my students if you want to contact me after the webinar offline. If you have some more technical questions that we can't get to, things like that, you're welcome to reach out to me anytime. So today, nice big title for the webinar here, Cloud Computing Big Three, comparing AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. First, just a little bit about me. I'm with New Horizons out of Omaha, Nebraska, part of the greater New Horizons global organization. Been doing technical training there for longer than I might care to admit to. Since the late 90s, been with New Horizons 1 years or so. You can probably call me a systems guy and be pretty accurate most of the time. Began my career in the Windows world, Windows Server, Windows Client, all that kind of fun stuff as we were going through those transitions, and then moved into quite a bit of virtualization work as virtualization took over the industry. And now with the advent of cloud computing, spending more and more time with my head in the clouds, as they say. I do work with all three of the major cloud providers out there, the ones we're going to talk about today, Azure, AWS, as well as Google Cloud, and then do a lot of work with VMware as well with their cloud offerings. So hopefully with my background and the material we have, we can make some sense out of this and get you pointed in the right direction. What we're going to talk about today, we're going to spend a little bit of time up front just making sure everybody's on a firm footing, what cloud computing is, why we care, how it gets utilized, just make sure we demystify a couple of the terms there. And then we'll turn our attention towards what we're going to refer to as public cloud computing, defining that for you in just a moment, and take a look at how you as a potential cloud customer can start to make your way through this morass, if you will, of cloud offerings out there. We see all this stuff that Amazon's doing with AWS versus Azure versus Google, and how can we start to make sense of all of that, and maybe what are some effective ways for you to start doing a comparison? I mean, how am I going to be able to tell which one's best for me? That's my goal for the webinar here, and I am going to try to leave a little bit of time for some wrap up and questions. So as Mayan mentioned, you got the questions window there. You can type your questions in, and we'll hopefully be able to get those when we finish up. And if not, again, I'll give you my email address again, and we can take some offline. I do want to frame the discussion here and let you know up front a couple of things I won't be able to answer today. Put the negative stuff out there first. You're really never going to hear, at least I hope I don't say it today, which one is the best cloud computing provider, because best, of course, is very, very subjective. Also, if you're sitting out there thinking, hey, this sounds great, how much is this going to cost me? The correct answer to that is going to be, it depends. Probably the correct answer to almost every question in life is it depends. Really depends on what you're using. We can't put a firm number on that until we know more about your business and what you're going to use. That's one of the things with cloud computing is it's a pay-as-you-go or pay-as-you-grow model. So, we can't say it's going to cost you $100 or $1,000 or $1 million. We just don't know until we can start getting into it. And then really not being able to tell you artificially without spending some time with you, look whether AWS or Google Cloud or Azure is going to be a best choice, or maybe a combination of those. Those questions really need much more time, effort, a lot more digging. Now, I hope with the information we're going to give you today that we can get you going in that direction, so that when you do try to tackle those questions, and you do need to answer them at some point in time, we can help you get there. All right, so that's what we're not going to be able to answer. So let's talk about what we are going to be able to answer. Cloud computing. You've all heard of cloud computing. That's why you're here. That's what we're going to talk about. You see a fairly generic definition of cloud computing here on the screen, on-demand delivering compute, database, storage, applications, other resources through a platform via some kind of public connection, aka the public internet, with some kind of pay-as-you-go pricing. That's a pretty generic definition, probably not surprising anybody with that. It's also not surprising that when we say everything is moving to the cloud, of course, well, not everything, but cloud computing is becoming a reality. And you're hearing companies, and certainly the big three that I'm going to talk about today, AWS, Microsoft, and Google, are really pitching a cloud-first type mentality, both from how they are engineering their products, how they are approaching their customers, how they're approaching their business models, and then really kind of pushing that down to us, the customer, that we should really start thinking about the IT design of our business as potentially being cloud first. You might not be there yet, but it's not going to be a very long time before that becomes a reality. Now, the statistics that I quoted here, RightScale, State of the Cloud 2018, that's a pretty amazing statistic out there. 96% of respondents are using cloud in some way. Using it much yet, they might be just getting their feet wet and testing things out, but that, I think that's pretty indicative of the greater industry out there. When we take a look at cloud computing and start to think about it, on that last slide, you saw a reference to public cloud only, private cloud only, and in the middle, hybrid. Well, what the heck are those things? These are very commonly referred to as the cloud deployment models. Now, when we look at public cloud versus private cloud versus hybrid cloud, private cloud is really what we have all been doing in our businesses since we started doing IT services. And private cloud implies that you are creating a private or closed network, a closed set of resources. You are building the resources for your company to be consumed by your company. You're not providing those resources to any outside entities, et cetera. It's our networks. Now, you may have physical data centers, you may have co-located in a data center. That really wasn't the point. But a private cloud is you build it, you pay for it all. Public cloud, which is what we're going to talk about primarily today, is when we're going to these outside entities, and we're focused, of course, on AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. They've built the infrastructure. They've built these data centers all around the world, and we'll talk about their global infrastructures. What they're doing essentially is renting you resources. They're going to rent you computing power and storage space and DR capabilities and things like that. Where it says that these resources are generally accessed over a public network like the internet, that doesn't imply or doesn't mean that those resources have to be publicly accessible. In other words, all of my servers are not going to be accessible via the public internet. It means that we are using that ubiquitous internet backbone. I'm still going to create private connections, private VPN connections, but the connectivity is built on the internet backbone. If you want to look at private versus public in a slightly different way, kind of get an analogy, private cloud is like being an owner. I'm building everything, I'm owning everything, or public cloud is I'm renting it. I don't want to own the infrastructure. I want to rent it from somebody else because it's more efficient, cheaper, et cetera. I won't go into that. Hybrid cloud, which when you really start digging into it and talk to people who are doing it and building these things, et cetera, everybody's pretty much in agreement that most environments are probably going to be in a hybrid cloud. And that's really where we're just using the best of both worlds. For most enterprises, there are going to be resources which you are still going to host in a private sense, whether it's in an on-premises data center, whether it's a co-located facility, et cetera. You're also going to start looking at some of your resources where it's going to make sense. Hey, let's move this to the cloud. Let's move our platforms to the cloud and jump on board with Microsoft 365, formerly known as Office 365. Hybrid really just implies that you're going to live in both worlds, and creating that connectivity between those, the ability to share data, move data, et cetera, between that public and private space. That's what hybrid is. I happen to be in that camp that most medium, large enterprise style environments are probably going to be in some kind of a hybrid mode. Certainly, some companies will be all in on the cloud and won't really have a physical infrastructure, but hybrid's probably going to be where we're at. And we'll look at how the different cloud providers pull that off. I mean, how does AWS approach hybrid cloud versus Google Cloud versus Azure? I have a couple of examples for that. As we start to think about cloud computing in general, the other thing that we start to think about, just kind of getting our minds wrapped around this, is to start to categorize computing by what we are using it for. So me as a customer, when I go to AWS or Azure, whoever I choose, and I start running resources there, we can start to categorize those or slot those out and say I'm using infrastructure as a service or platform as a service or software as a service, and I'll go through those and explain what they are. Now, keep in mind that these definitions and these things that we're talking about here, the differences between private cloud, public cloud, hybrid cloud, differentiating between an infrastructure as a service versus a platform as a service, this is only designed to give us a frame of reference so that as we start digging into the specifics of, okay, well, how does Microsoft do this with Azure, we can start to get our, like say, our minds wrapped around that. And then also we can start to use that in comparison. It's like, okay, if I'm really interested in platform as a service offering, how does Google approach that? How does Microsoft approach it, et cetera? So spend just a minute on these here. When a company is utilizing cloud computing, pick your favorite vendor, and we say that you are using infrastructure as a service. What that means is the types of resources that you're running in the cloud are those traditional, what we would call infrastructure type resources. That's going to be the virtual networking, creating machines, virtual machines. That's utilizing storage resources, et cetera. Remember, the cloud provider is actually running it all for you. They've got the physical servers running the hypervisor. It's going to be your VM virtual machine that you build on there, whether it's Windows, Linux, Unix, whatever flavor of OS you want to run, whatever applications it's running, that's your data. That's the operating system you're running. They're, as I like to say, renting you the capability that IaaS, or infrastructure as a service, is when we use cloud computing for those IT infrastructure type services. Platform as a service is the development tools, the programming tools, the code release tools, sometimes the databases that applications are utilizing. When a company decides to start utilizing cloud computing for those application development types of needs, we say they are consuming platform as a service offerings. And keep in mind, as we differentiate between those, it's just a way for us to start categorizing things so we can understand them. A company could start off their adventure in cloud computing just playing around and doing a couple of virtual machines and a little bit of storage. They may then grow in utilizing platform as a service or software as a service, as I'm going to talk about in a moment. One of the awesome things about cloud computing is its flexibility. We can start here and then we can migrate up both in a pay-as-you-go, pay-as-you-grow, and then also adding services on demand as we need them. So, development environments, development tools, application development, database layers, those are platform as a service offerings. Software as a service, SaaS, is where we are going to a cloud provider and purchasing the use of an application that they've developed. Now, probably the two easiest examples that everybody's going to be able to relate to, Microsoft 365, formerly known as Office 365. That's Microsoft's suite of tools for email, collaboration, instant messaging, Teams, all those different applications that are. And look on the Google side of the house, that would be the G Suite series of tools out there, their productivity tools, the word processor, the spreadsheet, et cetera. And then Gmail would be another software as a service. With SaaS, or software as a service, as a customer, I'm going and purchasing, renting, I guess is a better way to say it, those applications. The company's already developed those, the cloud computing company. I don't have to develop them, they've done that. I might be able to customize them, but they built it. So all of these definitions, public cloud, private cloud, hybrid cloud, the different usage models, software as a service, etc., is just a frame of reference for us to start thinking about cloud computing. All of this is generic. We can take any one of these definitions, any one of these concepts, and lay them over the top of a cloud computing provider, again, AWS, Microsoft, Google, etc. Say, how do you approach this? What offerings do you have in this space? Helps us with that organization and comparison. All right, last couple of just generic items here. Why is everybody going nuts on cloud computing out here? Well, there are as many reasons as there are companies out there. Economies of scale. One of the big things we always hear about is cost savings. And don't kid yourself, cloud computing has a cost. Absolutely, positively, you're going to pay these cloud computing providers. They're not charities. They're in it to make a profit. But the big thing with cloud computing is what we're going to try to eliminate is capital expenditures. Businesses hate CapEx. When a business has to write a big, giant, multi-million-dollar check to get a new application or process stood up, that's a big upfront investment. If we can take that cost and instead of it being a CapEx, transfer it over to an OpEx, operational cost. Say, okay, work out that $5 million to get all these resources stood up, because we could basically log into the cloud provider. I can start spinning up applications and databases, etc. There's no upfront cost. We're going to pay for them as we use them and as we grow. Businesses love that, transferring that CapEx to OpEx. Notice, as I'm saying that, I'm not necessarily talking about a cost savings, although there certainly could be. We're transferring that cost. There is going to be a cost of running these resources. However, we can amortize it out across a long period because it's a monthly or yearly operational cost rather than the upfront. That's the attraction. Last generic note here, why cloud computing? And now I'm talking to you as a technologist. I'm a systems guy. I'm a server guy, networking guy, etc. I'm the guy who's going to put together all your infrastructure out here. As a person in the IT world, DBA, a programmer, an infrastructure person like me, if you are not looking ahead and refactoring your skill sets, jumping on board with this idea of cloud computing, you are doing yourself a huge disservice personally. And again, you see a few salary survey numbers out here, and not just the salary survey numbers, but when we look at these surveys that companies are doing, and we look at the positions that are out there, the open positions, etc., they are increasingly cloud. As an IT person, if you try to hide from this, you're going to get left behind. You're going to come off from under your rock someday, and there's going to be nobody left for you to talk to. So you got to jump on board. All right. Frame of reference, check, got it. Why did we choose to talk about AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud? Why are we referring to these as the big three? And by the way, when I say big three here, that's my terminology. When New Horizons, I do lots of webinars for them, came to me and said, hey, let's do a webinar, I came up with that. So big three, I'm calling them that. I mean, no disrespect to all the other cloud companies out there. I know some of you are thinking, but IBM's got amazing offerings. They're cool, and so does Alibaba. I know, that's cool. I had to pick somebody. Here's the reason why I picked big three. This little chart here, some of you may recognize this. This is one of the Gartner Magic Quadrant rankings that they do. They do lots and lots and lots of these. This one is for infrastructure as a service. So Gartner taking a look at the state of the cloud out there and saying, okay, when we look at infrastructure as a service, that's your virtual machines, your storage, your networking in the cloud, etc., who are both the leaders in that area, and then who's really a visionary, who's pushing the technology. And it's pretty obvious, and this has been consistent over the last 5 or 6 years, where AWS, Microsoft, and Google are in that leading quadrant. I do want to caution you, and this is not just from my webinar point of view, but anytime you're looking at this, you can go out on the web right now and search Gartner Magic Quadrant Cloud, and you're going to see about 25 or 30 of these different ones out here. They do rankings for all kinds of specialized cloud services. So for instance, if you go out there and take a look at cloud-based financial services in Europe, you're going to see that Oracle happens to be one of the leaders in that. Okay, great. infrastructure as a service is sometimes held up as being kind of that prototypical cloud usage model that no matter what you do in the cloud, everybody's doing some infrastructure out there. So this is the one that tends to show up. That's why I decided to go with the big three. Now, who's better? AWS, Microsoft Azure, or Google Cloud? That's a question I can't answer for you. Call up for each one of those and you're going to get the same answer. They're the best. Okay. Now, when we take a look at these big three out here, AWS. And by the way, these definitions that I have for each one of these companies here, I didn't want to interpret these. I didn't want to put my own personal instructor spin on this because I teach all of this stuff. I teach Microsoft classes, I teach AWS classes, etc. So these definitions here, I literally clipped them right off of the vendors' websites. So if you got to the generic AWS page, this is like that tagline definition they have out there. I tried not to do that. AWS is sometimes thought of, and I'm just going to get to the AWS page here, is sometimes referred to as that largest public cloud provider. And again, every statistic can be spun in a million when you look at number of customers that they have. Okay, AWS tends to be in that leading quadrant consistently out there. No disrespect to any other company out there. Also, one of the things that AWS is pretty famous for, and I think this is a good thing, is the greatest breadth of services. And we'll talk about different kinds of services here in a moment, the compute services, the database services, et cetera. They probably have more different types of offerings than anybody else. Part of that is that Amazon was one of the original companies providing cloud services out there. Again, want to caution everybody, the marketing spin, with no disrespect to marketing people, but the marketing and sales spin from each one of the companies, they're always going to say they're best, they're first. AWS was one of the first companies offering cloud services out there. Now, they started off offering just a couple of things, some compute services and storage services, but if you're to go out to the just go out and use your favorite search engine and search for AWS and just look at their breadth. There's literally hundreds of different services out there. Another thing that is not necessarily unique among cloud providers, but is true for AWS, they have a massive footprint of physical data centers. I want to talk about that with each of these in just a moment. They've got data centers on pretty much every continent now, with the exception of Antarctica, and certainly in all the major regions of the world. AWS has also started to have some partnerships with companies like VMware. We'll talk about hybrid cloud out there. It's one of the services that makes them unique, and it's a way we can start to compare, okay, how is AWS different than the others? This can be there. A couple of other things that are kind of infamous or unique about AWS, along with that just massive list of services that AWS has, their release cycle. They are literally releasing either upgrades to services, new features, or new services entirely weekly. The list of new announcements from AWS every year is in the thousands, a couple of thousand new things each year, which again, it's just a mind-boggling pace of development out there. So AWS, certainly one of the big giant providers out there. Now, let's give the other ones their due out here. Microsoft Azure. So first of all, a little bit of terminology for you here. Azure is the brand name that Microsoft came up with for kind of that collection of their cloud services out there. So Azure is all things cloud to Microsoft. Whether I'm utilizing infrastructure as a service or databases or dynamics, etc., and Microsoft 365 / Office 365 slots there's a little bit of a different branding out there, but it's part of that greater array of cloud services. And again, I just picked the definition right off of Microsoft's page here, so I didn't want to interpret it out there for you. Well, what are some of the things that distinguish Microsoft a little bit maybe from the others? And just tried to pick out a couple of highlights here. Azure has been in the news a lot the last couple of years as really becoming one of the leaders out there, certainly firmly in the big three. But when we take a look at the growth rates, the year-over-year revenue growth, the year-over-year number of customer growth, adding services and things like that, Azure's been outpacing everybody. Now, of course, we can take all the statistics and wrap them up lots of different ways. If you start from farther behind and you go up a little bit, your percentage growth is better. Again, throwing away all that nonsense, they absolutely positively have been on a very aggressive path. The Microsoft 365 or Office 365 product, which is a classic software as a service product, is one of the big drivers of success. Microsoft's really leveraging that. To say that, quote unquote, everybody's using Microsoft 365, of course, is not 100% correct, but it's not too terribly incorrect either. I tried to look up some market penetration and market share statistics out there, and everything that I found was that Microsoft 365 and that enterprise market is probably owning in the 70 to 80% of the market share, which is just absolutely crazy out there. G Suite, by the way, is kind of the number two out there. One of the things that kind of sets Microsoft apart, and again, trying to give each customer their is that Microsoft really fashioned Azure as being a very easy onboarding for companies that are already Microsoft shops, if you will. Pretty much every enterprise I've run into, and again, in my more than enough years in IT, everybody's using Windows. We're all using Windows desktops, we're using Windows Office products, you've got Windows servers out there, all of your companies are running Active Directory, etc. Well, when Microsoft was approaching Azure, they were really looking at how can we take that really cemented in architecture and customer base that we have in the on-premises market and make it easy for those customers to transition over into a cloud-based environment. And when we look at the way Microsoft has architected Azure and developed Azure, they've really architected in make it easy for the customer. And again, that's a good thing. That's a winning strategy for Microsoft, and thus we see their growth rates. The other strategic thing that Microsoft has done, and again, I've been a Microsoft certified trainer since 1998, been doing this for a long time. Microsoft has not always been open-minded, if you will, and accepting of other environments, other operating systems out there. I remember teaching the old Windows NT classes and the Windows 2000 classes, and when people would start to bring up those quote-unquote other operating systems, Unix, Linux, etc., it was kind of like, what? There's other operating systems here? Well, Microsoft's done a 180. And again, credit their management to recognizing that in order to be the player, which every company wants to be the player in the enterprise market, they had to recognize, and not just recognize, but truly embrace that multi-platform environment. And a really interesting statistic about Azure is that if we look at all of the virtual machines running in the Azure cloud just globally, there's more Linux operating systems running in Microsoft's cloud than there are Microsoft servers. And you might think that Microsoft looks at that in a bad way. No, that's a good thing. That is evidence that they really, truly have embraced this idea of a multi-platform enterprise, that it cannot ever be anything other than a multi-platform enterprise. So again, hats off to our friends in Redmond. Google Cloud. Google Cloud, and again, not meaning any disrespect to any of these vendors because I work with all of them. They traditionally, when we talk about this big three, et cetera, they are typically referred to as a fairly distant third. Like you've got AWS out here with all its market shares, and Amazon, or excuse me, Azure down here somewhere is Google. Again, I don't mean that in any disrespect. Part of that is because when we look at things like the Gartner Magic Quadrant for infrastructure as a service, that really wasn't what Google Cloud was developed from or built from. That really wasn't its origins. Think of Google and think of Google as a company. Where have they come from? what have they done? And of course, the absolute number one thing that we're going to think about is, well, they made their name in search. I mean, I remember, I'm dating myself here, one of the very last Comdex shows in Las Vegas, for those of you old enough to remember Comdex, when literally Google had a little tiny booth of a couple of, folding tables out there, and the founders of Google were standing behind there trying to say, hey, we're a search company, pay attention to us, we're cool. I mean, they were nothing at that point in time. But anyway, when we take a cloud, say, hey, what makes Google Cloud unique? It wasn't grown from that infrastructure as a service model. Microsoft grew Azure by saying, look, all of our customers on premises are running Windows servers, and they're running Microsoft databases, and they're running Active Directory. So let's build that stuff in the cloud and give them a nice vertical way to get into the cloud. Perfect for that customer. That wasn't Google. None of you were running, quote unquote, Google servers in your data centers. They didn't exist. They didn't have that service. So when we take a look at what makes Google Cloud unique, Google was really built on the application. Google famously built this absolutely massive global network to run their search services. And then they piggybacked on that with application services and things like that. So where Google has made their mark is in the application, being able to take these, unbelievably large sets of data, search data originally, and make sense of it. So literally Google invented some of the application technologies that they're using that have now become open source standards. For instance, Kubernetes, which Kubernetes, without going down a rabbit hole here, is really an orchestration services for containers, helps me deploy, manage container services, etc. Well, Google pretty much invented that. That was their technology. Now, Kubernetes is truly a linchpin technology in the container orchestration world. And as everyone now is going crazy for container services, we start to look at, well, can I do containers in Kubernetes and AWS? Sure, they have those services. Can I do containers in Kubernetes and Azure? Sure, they have those services. I go over to Google Cloud and say, can I do services there? And they're like, yeah, we invented that. Okay? We're not piggybacking. That's ours. We built that. And that's open sourced, obviously. So each one of these cloud providers, if we try to strip back the marketing hype, and I try to, in my classes, always try to get past the marketing hype out there, they each have kind of that unique approach to cloud computing. And that's one of the things that you kind of want to have in the back of your mind as we start to look at, okay, what am I going to do in the cloud? Who am I going to go with? This may very well be the most important idea that I'm going to leave you with here, and may very well be the most important thing you can ever do as far as cloud computing, in starting to think about, how am I going to go out there and compare? Because let's be honest here, all of the cloud companies are pretty, and I know if I had salespeople in the room right now from AWS and Microsoft and Google with me, they would be beating me up and shoving me out the window because they all think they're better than each other. But you know what? I can build virtual machines in all of them. I can spin up databases in all of them. I have storage in all of them. The vast majority of their services, when we get past all the marketing hype, they're duplicative. They can do, now, each one has their own specialties, and no disrespect to anybody, they all do things a little bit uniquely, but in large part, it's like driving down the street shopping for cars. And you drive past the Honda dealership, the Ford dealership, the Toyota, the Chevy, the Dodge dealership. You know what? They're all pretty good cars. These are all pretty good cloud providers. Now, why am I saying this is important stuff here? Number one thing on the list, define the business need. Why is your company looking at cloud computing? Is it purely like you can't do what you need to do because of the CapEx involved? You need a way around that. Is it because you are maxing out or not having the technology available to do what you need to do? Maybe it's disaster recovery you need to address, and you just can't get the kind of redundancy and disaster recovery you need in a physical data center environment, a private environment. The cloud providers can give you that in a turnkey. Maybe it's compliance. More compliance standards out there than we know what to do with. Well, all of these cloud providers are investing in getting their infrastructure certified with all of these different compliance standards out there. All these cloud providers have specific GovCloud installations for government entities, etc. So defining the why is the most critical thing you can do. Because if you're just going out there and saying, well, we need to start looking because everybody else is, okay, maybe, but eventually, if you're not drilling down to what your real business and technology needs are, you're going to run the risk of making some really bad decisions along the way, not just with what company to go with, but what technologies to implement. The second bullet point is where we get the geeks involved. And I say geeks, and I point to myself when I say that. This is where we start to think about the infrastructure as a service, the platform as what kinds of technology are we going to be looking at utilizing in a cloud provider. This is where drawing distinctions between the cloud providers makes a difference. And part of those distinctions will be cost. Notice I'm avoiding the cost thing quite a bit here because each provider has different ways that they're going to charge you for virtual machines or storage, et cetera. Well, once I know that I'm going to be utilizing a lot of applications maybe, well, now I can look at each vendor and say, okay, for your serverless applications, not only how are those set up and deployed, but how am I going to be billed for that? Then you're starting to get into that real, true, detailed apples to apples comparison. But again, I have to get to that particular point. Already mentioned regulatory compliance needs, et cetera, disaster recovery. All of these bullet points here represent some specifics about your business, your needs that will help you start to distinguish, where I can really, truly start to compare how does Amazon versus Azure versus Google Cloud do this particular service. But again, without knowing this is, then we're just kind of groping in the dark out there. All right, a few other items to talk about here. I mentioned the global infrastructures, and again, no disrespect to any cloud provider out there. They're all doing the same thing. They all have, and I literally took these screenshots off of the provider's websites this morning, so this is current. This is a look at the AWS Global Infrastructure. So where you see all these circles with numbers in them, these represent regions. So a region, and by the way, all the cloud providers do this, a region is an area of the country that they're, excuse me, not country, but area of the world they're in. So for instance, for AWS in North America, we've got the Virginia region, we've got the Ohio region, we've got the Northern California region, we've got the Oregon region, et cetera. And then the number inside the circle is an availability zone. Thinking about an availability zone as brick and mortar. That's the brick and mortar data centers. So for instance, for AWS in the region, they have 3 availability zones. That's 3 brick and mortar installations, data center, that are completely and totally separate from each other, separate power, separate networking, in different flood zones, et cetera, and are completely redundant. Now, sounds like I'm bragging up AWS. Well, you know what? Here's Microsoft's global infrastructure. Looks like they're kind of in the same places out there. Now, of course, specific geographies will vary just a little bit, but you know what? Microsoft has a very similar global infrastructure. And if we look at Google, theirs isn't quite as extensive, but hey, look, pretty much the same thing. And I actually have several Google data centers right across the river from me. I'm in Omaha, Nebraska. Sister city right across the Missouri River is Council Bluffs, Iowa. There's a Google installation over there. I drive by it all the time. Now, saying that all providers are building out these massive infrastructures out there. And so does it matter that, one specific provider has 3 availability zones in one particular region versus 2 availability zones, et cetera? Well, in the grand scheme of things, they all have this massive infrastructure. However, it may matter a lot to you. If you're running a global business, a global organization, and you are wanting to locate resources physically inside of a specific country, whether it's for business reasons, compliance reasons, or whatever, well, that's where comparing the infrastructures of these companies would matter to you because you have that specific need. If I'm running the latest website to make a bill there and I have a fairly large customer base that is located in Europe, well, the fact that all of these providers have physical data centers in Europe where I could put resources to physically locate my web servers close to my customers, that's a good thing. It might matter to me that Amazon literally spun up one of their newest regions in Sweden and they have a physical presence in Sweden where maybe another one doesn't. That might matter to you. But again, they all have global infrastructures. Last thing I will say about this, one of the things that makes cloud computing incredibly unique and something that we just can't do in a practical way with an on-premises scenario is me as a customer. When I go to stand up a web server, I pretty much have carte blanche in global infrastructures for these companies. I can put that web server anywhere I want to. I could have a web server running in US West. I could have one in US East. I could put one in France Central and France South. I can put them anywhere I want to out there. Of course, I pay every time I deploy those resources out there. They're going to cost me money. It's pay as you go. As a private company, if you were to think about, okay, I want a web server in France, I've got to build out an infrastructure in France, you couldn't do that. Nobody can afford that. With a cloud provider, I literally could log into my Azure account and say, where do you want that web server at? Click, click, click. I can start spinning up a server and having it done in a couple of minutes. So the ease of deployment across this massive infrastructure out here is something that, again, we can't accomplish that in a private way. Last thing I'll say about this global infrastructure out here is this also factors very, very heavily into when we have HIPAA or Sarbanes-Oxley or whatever compliance standard, and your data needs to exist or maybe not leave a specific geographical region. For instance, for HIPAA or PCI compliance, whatever it happens to be, my customer data must remain in the continental United States. It may not go outside the continental United States. Well, when I stand up my storage resources and my server resources, if I say I want my storage to be in US Central, that cloud provider is not going to put it anywhere else. That's my data. They're not going to pick my data up, move it over to Germany unless I say it's okay to do that. And that is absolutely critically important from a compliance standpoint. So, do they all have global infrastructures? Yep, and they're getting bigger and better all the time. To start to wrap this up, I'm a trainer. I can talk forever. I took one service, just out of the hundreds of services that these cloud providers run out there, and tried to give you a way to compare them. So let's say I'm deploying a cloud environment, I'm exploring, I'm looking at doing some stuff here, and I've decided that the ability to build a hybrid cloud is critical to my business need. To be able to maintain on-premises resources, have them seamlessly integrate with cloud resources, maybe move resources back and forth, et cetera. That's a big deal to me. I analyzed my business case, my business need, and that's what I came up with. Okay, so now I can go to these big three and start to investigate what do they have by way of hybrid cloud. And by the way, this is not all of their hybrid cloud offerings, but I tried to pick what is their big shiny thing that everybody's going to pay attention to. And so, for instance, Amazon Web Services. 2 years ago, they formed a strategic partnership with the virtualization company. I know them very well. I'm a VMware certified instructor. They have a product. It's licensed. It will cost you. You're going to pay money. It's called VMware Cloud on AWS. Now, if you are a VMware shop, if you're using VMware vSphere to virtualize servers on premises, what VMware Cloud on AWS gives you is the ability to run vSphere clusters ESXi servers and a vCenter server in the Amazon cloud and have that seamlessly linked with your on-premises vSphere environment. Now, you need networking connectivity between those, obviously, but the fact that I can use exactly the same tools, exactly the same web clients to build a virtual machine on premises, a virtual machine in the cloud, vMotion, those servers back and forth. If I determine that, yeah, that really does slot into my business case. I'm a VMware customer, we're doing some stuff in cloud, having a seamless hybrid cloud available and not have me change my on-premises infrastructure away from VMware. If I just sold you, well, there's a chip in the pot for VMware and AWS, VMware Cloud and AWS. Be a killer offering. Now, if we look at that same scenario, but say, well, I'm not necessarily a VMware customer. I haven't virtualized all my internal infrastructure on vSphere, et cetera. That's not really important to me. Microsoft has a product called Azure Stack. Remember, these are all licensed products. If you use something in the cloud, you pay. What Azure Stack is Microsoft's hybrid cloud environment. And to try to simplify this as much as I can, when you log into the Azure console, the Azure management console, it's a web console, and servers in the cloud, et cetera. Well, what Azure Stack is taking that exact same technology, not just the web-based client, but the technology used to deploy virtual machines and databases, et cetera. Azure Stack is you running that same management stack in your on-premises data centers. Now, we have network connectivity between the two, so my on-prem servers can talk to the cloud servers, et cetera. But with Azure Stack, my admins get to use exactly the same management tools, whether they're deploying and managing things on-prem or deploying and managing things in the cloud. That's a bit of an oversimplification for you, but that's okay. Now, put yourself in that particular use case. If that is something that is meaningful to me, and I'm comparing cloud providers against each other, notice how we're getting specific enough now where we can start to make comparisons and draw distinctions between these cloud companies. And this is where you, as an individual company, you're going to come up with that ranking of, oh, they're the best because it's specific to you. What if we call up our friends out in Sunnyvale? Google. What does Google Cloud have? Now, keep in mind that Google really didn't come from that mindset of infrastructure as a service like the other cloud providers did. They came at it more from a programmatic standpoint out there. And if we take a look, Google has something called the Google Services Platform. That really is the name of the technology. Actually, it's brand new. It's in beta right now. What that does is it allows me to build a hybrid application infrastructure, using some of the tools like Kubernetes so that I can get an application and an application management infrastructure that has the ability to lay across a public and a private cloud space, allowing me to manage those applications. Again, I'm not saying this is the right or the wrong way, but notice the approach here is a little bit different. Now, if I polish off my crystal ball, do I think that Google is probably going to get some additional hybrid offerings that kind of slot more in that traditional infrastructure as a service mode for companies? Yeah, they probably will. They're going to respond to customer demand, but you see their approach is a little bit more application centric. Again, not good, not bad, just different. So defining that business case, I know I'm going back to that same thing here again, critically important. So that's how we can start to compare. And could do the same thing if you were to say, well, we're super database heavy. I use a lot of SQL, I use a lot of Oracle, I use a lot of MySQL, I use a lot of Postgres, et cetera. Okay, with that kind of specifics in mind, then we can start to dig in and say, okay, how does AWS approach relational databases versus Microsoft versus Google, et cetera? That's where you can start to get some of these comparisons. But you got to get pretty specific. We're not just saying who's best. So where does this leave us? Well, obviously in the grand scheme of cloud computing, we're taking a 0.0000001% slice of cloud computing here. We have classes that I teach. I mean, I teach an infrastructure class for AWS that lasts all week. So we can only take a small slice here. My advice to not just you, but all the students and customers I work with is, in the beginning, explore. I stuck with the big three here. Alibaba's got great offerings. Oracle has cool offerings. Cisco's in some partnerships with Google doing some things. IBM is obviously a huge player out here with this. In the beginning, you want to get your foot in as many as possible. Now, whether that is trolling their websites, watching their free online training and stuff like that, maybe it's taking an introductory course. Every one of these vendors has, sometimes it's a half day, sometimes it's a 1 day, sometimes it's a 2 day introductory course. Take it. It's a small investment to start to learn how to do it. Drill on your business needs and realize your business needs might change over time. What is the thing that's driving you to the cloud? Because once you define that, then we can start to see, where does one company shine. Go beyond the hype and sales pitch. And again, no disrespect to the salespeople out there, but I got a 30-second commercial I see on TV. I got to get down to the specifics. I need not only my business case, but I need my real true IT people involved with that. And that's the fourth bullet point. You got to have the right people around the table. I can't tell you how many times when I'm teaching classes, I'll have students introduce themselves, tell me about their background and stuff like that, and I say, okay, well, why are you in this class? Well, I'm leading the cloud initiative for my company. Okay, that's great. What's your technical background? They say, well, I'm a DBA or I'm a server guy, etc. Like, you might want to bring them networking people around the table as well too, because you're going to be making some decisions about networking here, and if you don't have the networking people around the table, you're going to make some bad choices. So get all the right people involved. Maybe not up front, obviously, but along the way, you got to have the right people around the table. And then my last piece of advice here for you: control the process. And here's what I mean by that. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen that. You're starting to investigate cloud computing. You're thinking about it, etc. Maybe you start deploying some test environments. And by the way, all these vendors have trial subscriptions, free accounts that you can get. They all have their own twist on that. And you may go down the route of AWS. Okay, we're starting to stand up some test resources in AWS. This is looking good. This is going good, etc. And then all of a sudden you talk to somebody in a business unit that you don't talk to very often and find out that, oh yeah, they moved 90% of their resources out to Azure last year. It's like, well, why'd you do that? Because we just did. Well, why didn't you involve us? Because we just did it. Control the process. It is way, way, way harder to re-engineer something if you go down a path and then decide, oops, I got to make a left turn and go a different direction. To the greatest degree possible, control that process. Do it right up front. All right, working for a long time now. Little wrap up here. New Horizons obviously is a training company. I'm a trainer. That's what I spend my life doing, working with customers like you. So we'd love to see you in our training classes. If you don't know who your local New Horizons training center is, just go to newhorizons.com. We'll help you figure it out from there. Take a look at the offerings out there. Again, as a training provider, we work with all of these companies. Personally, I teach a ton of AWS courses. I teach a ton of VMware courses. I teach a ton of Microsoft courses. I teach a little bit of Google stuff, just kind of getting into that, not quite as much there. Whether it's myself or other highly qualified trainers around, we absolutely positively want to help you in any way we can. That's why we are in business, is to help you succeed. So please use us for that. You see my email address there. I welcome personal follow-ups. If you want to shoot me an email, post-webinar, talk about something more specific, or want to talk about a specific class, again, New Horizons sales reps can help you. But I'm glad to talk with you as well. So, all right, we'll see if we got any questions out there.
Thank you so much, Sean. If anyone has questions, please feel free right now to type those in. We'll stay on the line for a few minutes to answer those. But just to echo what Sean was saying, please reach out to your local New Horizons Center for more information if you're interested in any of the material that was just presented or any other courses you'd like training on. Another reminder is that the session is being recorded and you will receive a link to view the session recording, so you can pass that along to anyone who wasn't able to join, or if you wanted to review anything, we'll have that there for you. So we do have one question, Sean, that came in, and it's actually a long one. So it says, in a hybrid environment, what happens if renters' applications conflict with each other based on the environment security? For example, say my company has applications that run only if TLS 1.0 is disabled, and another renter has applications that run only if TSL 1.0 is enabled. How would these coexist in a hybrid cloud environment?
Yeah, so a couple of things there. First of all, when we say we're going to run an application, realize that that's your application. You are 100% in control of that application. Now, it could be a commercial off-the-shelf application, it could be something that you build, etc., but that's your application. So when you say you're going to run that application in a cloud provider, you're going to define all of those properties, whether it uses, TLS 1.2, 1.0, etc. You have 100% control over that. Now, if it is a software as a service scenario, so maybe I'm using a software as a service, the cloud provider is running that and I'm renting that application, plus I have my own on-prem version, since their conflict, then you'd have to make a choice of, well, maybe using the software as a service and the cloud vendor wouldn't be the right choice. Maybe I would need to think about running that application myself in the cloud, whether I do that on web servers or serverless or containers or whatever, so I can control the version of TLS utilized there. But you really are in control of everything you do in the cloud. However you build it, however you set it up, that's the way it's going to run. So it's not that someone's going to force you to do it one way or the other.
Great, thank you for the answer. That's actually the one question that we had. Sean, you did such a great job just covering the big three. So thank you again for coming and speaking on our behalf. And everyone, this is the end of the webinar. Thank you for joining us. Hope to see you on other webinars that we have. Thank you very much. You may now all log off.